Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. As mentioned, I am a futurist, but what might surprise you is I'm going to focus first on the past, as I found that history has been the most instructive signal that I can get in terms of where the world's going. But as that first quote indicates, looking backwards is very, very helpful. But before I do that, the learning and unlearning that we all need to do is very talked about. But the big focus really is on that unlearning, because the world that's emerging is very different than the experience set. Our rigidity as humans gets set in, and then when something different happens, it's very hard for us to respond. So learning from our current experience base isn't sufficient. We need to learn from experiences that evolved years and years ago, which is why I focus on history. So the question became, what does history tell us about the future? The first is the scientific revolution, because it drove the knowledge base that created our current world. And it's very, very similar to the knowledge explosion that I anticipate. And on the back of that knowledge explosion, what's possible as a society? The second piece, maybe not as positive, is that we look an awful lot like that first revolution. The 1800s to 1840 were defined by human misery. And unfortunately, we have signals in our world today that look very much like that past. But on a positive note, we then basically looked at a world of 100 years that built this current modern era. That 100-year period was fascinating to look back and consider, and fortunately, it got us to where we are. So as I pursued this innovation wheel formed. It captures many of the inventions, innovations, human actions that created the world that we all enjoy. And so then the question became, what was it about that 100-year period that allowed us as a society to do that, and can we learn from that? And so the biggest takeaway is it was a period in history that we never saw before, and many believe we'll never see again. And that is a period where so many domains converged on one another, whether it was geopolitics or society or science and technology. And it was through that convergence that we shaped the world. The focus was standard of living. It was our well-being. And that focus was driven by catastrophe. If you think back to the era of the past, Great Depression and the two world wars forced humans into action. And that really is a big piece of the story. It has taken catalysts for humans to act in the past. And we did it this way. This eye test, which is a series of building blocks that came together in ways that shaped our current world, is really instructive. It tells us that if we peer into the future and understand the building blocks across these domains, we might be able to assess possibility. Before I do the possibility piece, take a look at that list. This is the characteristic set that existed in the 1920s. Find me something on that list that doesn't exist again today. The takeaway should be that we look a lot like a period that led to those catastrophes. Not a prediction, but something to consider from a learning perspective, and can we apply that learning as we think about the future? So what have I learned in that very quick dance through history? First, we are a very stubborn species. We don't change unless we're forced to, and that example of catastrophe is a good example. It takes something to drive humans. But when we get there, we are really, really good at doing change. And the great example, he gave some, I'll give a different one. The World War II phenomena forced humans to act. And what you see here are a series of actions. And so therefore, the fundamental takeaway is not so much a prediction of the future, but it's a rehearsal of the future. How do we rehearse the future as a society in ways that allow us to manage it effectively forward? The big signal that I have taken away is that if convergence was the driver of that prior era, I see it happening again. There's convergence occurring across just about every domain. And then lastly, is through the back of convergence, how might the world come together? And what does it mean for the world? So how do we rehearse? So that question led to this next eye test, which is really a convergence model that helps us think about the building blocks across these domains. What's happening with science and technology, what's going on geopolitically, economically, et cetera. Let's focus vertically in the time that we have, and do so by working 3 building blocks. And obviously artificial intelligence has to be one of them because that's a dominant conversation. So when we think AI, the big discussion today is prompt engineering and generative AI and what it might mean to the world. but it's manifesting itself in ways that we might not be thinking about. So humanoid robots, side by side with us as humans, enabled by AI in ways that it was never enabled before. And that phenomena is making humanoid robots viable in unstructured environments, and in doing so rapidly. What does that world look like, where we're awkwardly working side by side with a humanoid robot? And it is happening faster than we think. And then the second one, which is a popular one for me, is virtual reality. Not because it's a buzzword, but because the potential for virtual reality is not understood. The mother was reunited with her dead 8-year-old daughter. AI animated her, obviously, and it was very real. And the question for society as we think about these scenarios, is it good for society? Is this something you would do? Reconnect with somebody that you've lost. Now, as impactful as all that is, what's happening societally is likely to be more impactful. And so as we track some of these building blocks, we're already seeing some of these phenomena. One is clearly a fall in the working age population that is occurring around the world. This is a global phenomena. And we're already hearing conversations about the need to automate aggressively because we just can't find enough workers. Building on that is that we're having less children. And many people believe that's not a phenomenon that's going to change anytime soon, if ever. And then, of course, we are an aging society, and this phenomena, again, is expected to ramp. That visual impresses me. First time in 2018 that there were more 65-year-olds on the planet than under 5. And then lastly, and importantly, generations have always driven change. The difference in how generations think drive change. And here's a big one. There's this notion that a lot of wealth is going to be inherited by folks, children of the baby boomers and silent generation. And that's an open question as far as I'm concerned, because we're used to this 4-segment life cycle. And the world's already rapidly moved to a 5-segment life cycle, where we have children later in our lives, we have them as dependent later in our lives. When they move on, we have dependent parents. And then when we retire, we're likely to retire as dependent, because although we're living longer, we're not necessarily living healthier lives. And so where does that 84 trillion actually go? Long-term care or as an inheritance to our children? And then just in wrapping up, scenarios, they're forming all around us. This convergence is driving a number of different scenarios. Some are listed here. AI-facilitated war is something that's already happening in parts of the world. And the second one being, where is globalization heading? And although there's an anti-globalization sentiment around the world, there is another phase coming. Somebody from Africa mowing my lawn in New Jersey, or sitting in the office side by side with me doing accounting work. That world's coming. So think about that scenario where you can do anything remotely around the world as another phase of globalization, if you will. And then lastly is this notion of how far does society take automation? And as you might imagine, this is a highly polarized discussion regardless of where you go. Many believe we'll never take it far enough, and some believe it's going to change everything. So clearly, automation is going to go fairly far. It's just a function of how far society takes it. If that innovation wheel from the past built our current world, are we heading towards a place where a new innovation wheel can form? And so this innovation wheel, as I walk around it, looks at our areas of well-being and what's possible. So for example, in the area of health and wellness, can digital twins help us solve heart condition? Now think of the applications of that as we move forward. And then as I finish up, every one of these domains is seeing invention and innovation that we believe will have a very positive influence on the world and our well-being. It's just, again, a function of how far society is willing to constructively manage the path. Every domain has significant change on the horizon, and that's really why this is such a difficult period for us to think about the future and rehearse it.